We now come to the matter of the pastoral industry. Pastoral Australia is probably the most important by land area for our rural enterprises. More land in Australia is used for pastoral purposes than anything else. That's largely because you can run stock over very marginal land. And so much of the cattle industry, say in the north of Australia, Northern Territory, Northern Queensland and so on, is not very productive land. And so it's still very practical to run it for pastoral purposes, even though it would be too poor to be able to use for more intensive purposes, and maybe doesn't have the characteristics that suit cropping and so on. Pastoral Australia tends to be separated into three major types of stock, and that is the cattle industry as either beef cattle or dairy, and the sheep industry. Sheep in Australia occupy an area of land which is largely overlapping with what we could call the broad acre cropping areas of Australia, and so some of the best sheep growing area is also subject to cropping, and there is often very complex land use arrangements where we have mixed farming, where both sheep are kept and the land is also used for cropping. And the advantage is that you can spell the land, in other words give it a rest, by going from cropping to pastoral and then back again, and so the land basically rejuvenates itself with the different land uses. That's very useful. There are some parts of Australia which are exclusively for pastoral purposes, and they tend to be more likely to be those parts of Australia where we're more likely to see cattle. Cattle are able to thrive in a far broader range of environments. Sheep are limited. They don't like wet climates. They end up with foot rot and other problems. And they don't like the semi-arid conditions of many parts of Australia. Even though, curiously enough, covered with all of their wool, they're still able to survive and flourish in relatively warm parts of Australia. When we look at the cattle industry we have quite a large herd in Australia, distinguished or differentiated by the breed. And I won't go through all of the details of the different breeds and so on in this listing or in this lecture, but I'll leave it to you to read the study guide. So rather than simply read out the study guide to you, I'll let you go back and read that. In the study guide, you will find that there's a lot of background detail, history, a lot of statistics of generally giving the character of the beef industry. Specifically for the valuer, however, you really need to know a few things that aren't quite as complex as all of the history of Australia's agriculture and so on. However useful that is to know in the background. From the valuer's point of view, first of all, when you go onto a property, you need to know enough about the land use to be able to at least talk to the farmer, the owner, and ask sensible questions related to value. And so it means that you do have to understand a bit about breeds. Nothing worse than seeing a cow and calling it a sheep or something, but that even comes down to being able to recognise the dominant breeds. And so I do recommend that you take not just the study guide seriously, but also take a little bit of time, maybe in your own time, to Google up photographs of the different dominant breeds. And that's very useful because you'll recognise that there are different colours and different shapes and even different sizes. Some are better for dairy, some are better for beef and so on. I'll leave that to you in your own time. The general characteristics of running a beef property is that depending on the location, beef does not require a huge amount of day-to-day management. You basically set the cows in a paddock and you go away and leave them. Depending on where you are, you may have to be careful to maintain your fences, especially in places where farming is a bit more intensive. You also need to consider the provision of water and the quality of your grasses. Again, depending on the area, there's almost as many different ways to grow cattle as there are areas in Australia. Some areas are fenced, some are not. Some use improved pastures, some do not. Some have water resources naturally, some have a lot of sometimes very elaborate systems to provide water to stock. And so you need to be aware of what is the dominant approach in your area when you go to look at a cattle property. What is the fencing like? Are there fences at all? Is the pasture natural grasses or improved? What's the situation regarding water? They're the big questions. Next, it's useful to have a bit of an understanding of the way that the growth of cattle is worked out. How often do cows reproduce? How long does it take them to get to market? What management procedures, what interventions in terms of disease control, tick control, other areas of management are important. What takes up the farmer's time, basically, in getting the cows from birth to market. And as I say, these are partly local, and a lot of the possibilities are listed out in the study guide. When we come to the sheep industry, it's a little more complex. Sheep take more management. Typically, they will need to be sheared annually. You don't do that with cows. There is a secondary market for wool, and so depending on whether you're growing cattle for the purpose of wool or for meat, it affects your management and many other things. Many of the issues are similar in terms of disease control, fencing, provision of water, quality of pastures, and so on. In sheep areas, it's not unlikely that you may be in mixed farming area. And so if you go onto a property, say in the Riverina down around Wagga or many other parts of Australia for that matter, it's likely that sheep aren't the only thing which are being done on the property. So you really have to understand both the sheep industry and also the crops which are likely to be grown in a district. With sheep, understanding the markets is very, very important. How the meat gets to market, also very important. What is the demand for wool? What's the international demand? What is the competition coming from synthetic fibres? What are issues of things like, background stock of wool, especially because it's quite a durable substance. It can be left in bales for a very long time before it's sold. Sometimes it's oversupply, sometimes undersupply, and so on. But understanding the markets, things like live meat export, the changing relationships that Australia has with different other countries in terms of who is buying our meat, either beef or lamb. Also, who else is producing comparable and competing meats? Do they have the same problems with disease and so on? Will they be able to infiltrate some of the markets that Australia has won and has held and is relying on for the support of the industry in Australia? There is a lot of international news, if you like, or international trade, which is very important to understand these industries, because both rely very heavily on exports to be viable. All of these things take you outside of the realm of simply learning which end of a cow to look at and so on. It really means that to understand your industry, if you are in a pastoral area, you need to spend a bit of time in homework going through the media, the specific media related to rural production and especially related to the industry. And so reading up on what is happening to Australia's export markets for meat, what is happening in terms of climate. If we've just come out of a drought, or if we're just in the middle of one, what is that doing to the supply and demand of stock? What is it doing to the attitude of landowners to holding stock, to acquiring stock, to selling stock, and so on? In some cases, you can get to the stage, and it hasn't been very long ago, that you can get to the stage in some areas, it's almost, the stock get to the point where they're almost less valuable per beast than the cost of the bullet to go and put them down, because they're not in good shape. But out of care for them, it's very hard looking on a herd of animals basically starving to death. So there's a lot of issues involved in the industry. Read the study guide, become familiar with the life cycle of both cattle and sheep, get to know the markets, and look at the effects that's likely to have on property. When we get to looking at property, we find that the capacity of the property to support stock becomes the dominant element of value. Secondary is the infrastructure on the property to go and support that stock. And so you'll be looking very closely at the carrying capacity. In the study guide, we go over the different units of carrying capacity, beast area value, what a standard beast is as cattle, or in the sheep language, often we talk about dry sheep equivalents, and they are defined for you in the study guide. And I recommend that you go to the study guide, underline those factors and so on. Once you have an understanding as a valuer of the industry in general and the property's carrying capacity in particular, then you're getting fairly close to valuing, because at that point you're now understanding the value of the property as a business, and you can compare it to other similar enterprises in the district. And so look at the quality of comparable properties, the quality of the infrastructure, their fencing, their water, their pastures and so on, and buildings and etc., and their carrying capacity. And then you can look at your serious valuation. Like other forms of valuation in the rural area, primary method is always as direct as possible, so direct comparison is useful. That does come down to land areas and the value of the land areas on comparable properties and so on. Before we finish, it's important to look at the dairy industry. Now, the dairy industry has had quite a colourful history. Some of that is recounted for you in the study guide. Dairy industry is very, very important because dairy products are an important part of our diet, not just the Australian diet, but also a certain amount of dairy gets exported. Many dairy products, and all you have to do is walk down your local supermarket to get an idea of the variety of things that come to us that come from the dairy industry. Everything from cheese and yogurt at one extreme end to the milk we put in our tea and coffee. The dairy industry has been subject to considerable technological improvements, but also it's been particularly influenced by market impacts, especially the effects of the larger retailers and the deregulation of the industry. Some of that now is virtually ancient history. But if you're a city person and you want to understand the dairy industry, you can walk into your local supermarket and look at the range of prices for a litre of milk. It will go from about $1 or so for a litre of basic milk, right up to, in some cases, 3 or 4 times that amount for something that's a little bit more special. And you can ask yourself, is the difference between the discount litre of milk and the regular branded litre of milk, what is different in there? the end of the day, health standards being what they are, not very much difference in the product. But if you're paying $1 and a bit for a litre of discount milk, or you have the choice of buying the bottle next to it, which is probably chemically identical, but you might be paying at least twice as much for it, you can ask yourself, well, what am I really doing here? What you're doing is really looking at the revenues that the dairy farmer ultimately gets. Unfortunately, that has meant that the dairy farmers now are operating on extremely lean margins, where they need to operate at a fairly substantial scale, employ a lot of fairly advanced milking and milk handling technology, and be very efficient getting it to market, because a lot of that milk ends up going out for $1 a litre on the shop shelves. That has meant that the price of dairy farms has therefore not been very attractive, because one way or another the dairy industry has a lifestyle attached to it which doesn't suit everybody. If you're growing cattle, as two of my uncles were until recently, it's a delightful lifestyle. You can go out for an afternoon and ride around the boundaries to check how the fences are going. And that might be all you do on your cattle farm for that day, maybe even for that week. Because if everything is intact and humming along, the cows just sit there and grow, eat grass, do what cows do. If you're a dairy farmer, by comparison, and dairy farming used to be very, very common, dairy farmer has to bring in all the cows twice a day and milk them. And so that means that it's a 7-day-a-week job. And it's also a 7-day-a-week job that requires a fair bit of effort, even with all the technology that's available at present. Some of that has changed and become a little bit more technologically complex when we talk about feedlots and so on for beef, as opposed to just having them running around out on open pasture and so on. But I think you'll probably get the idea. To be a dairy farmer means a lot of work. And when you go from a lot of work to earn your living to only being able to sell your milk so that it gets to the supermarket shelves at $1 a litre, you find that you're working very hard for a lifestyle and not necessarily for a very attractive business. And so the dairy industry has encountered a lot of rationalisation. It means that if you are valuing dairies, you have to understand the industry, the markets for the product, the reliance on the milking equipment and milk handling equipment and so on. You have to be able to look very carefully at the value of the plant machinery involved in that enterprise and things like the condition of the herds. In all cases where you're dealing with animals in farming, you have to be very aware of the quality of the herd. And so it's one thing to know that cows will take this long to go from birth to the abattoirs, but it's another to actually look at the beasts and see what type of quality they're looking at. Do they have disease? A number of variables to do with just the quality of the herd. And so that's another dimension. Not totally necessary for the valuer if you are staying and being a property valuer to understand the herd in great detail, because after all, a new owner can over a period of time replace the herd or improve the herd, or on the other hand run it down if they don't know what they're doing. But it certainly is helpful, and to be able to appreciate differences between the subject property and the comparables, especially in the case where you're considering valuation on a walk-in, walk-out basis. Okay, it's always best to go back and read the study guide carefully, also read the textbook, and take the invitations that I've put out in this presentation to read the media as well. Look at the cattle industry, look at the sheep industry and so on. See what you can learn about how it's going today. What are the issues today? What are the markets doing? What are the conditions on the farm? Are there any diseases and so on? And I do invite you to do that now to really complete this module.